But, nevertheless, that's the case.
Question number 2.
Speaker.
Andrew Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Finance and asks, what reports has he received on how rising wages and low inflation mean more money for New Zealand families?
Good question. The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, Statistics New Zealand reports show that since the government was elected in 2008, average wages have increased 25%. And today sits at just over $58,000. That is $11,000 more than in 2008. This 25% increase compares to inflation over the same period of 12%. High wage increases don't necessarily mean high real wage increases. For instance, in the year to September 2008, wages increased by 5.1%, but inflation was also high and it increased by 5.1% in that year. So low inflation means that higher wages earned by hard-working New Zealanders are going further.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, Andrew Bailey.
What trends in the growth of after-tax wages can he report?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the money households get to spend is their after-tax income, and the government's reduction in taxes on income and savings in 2010 have helped lift take-home pay. Under this government, after-tax wages have increased 31%. That is, the average take-home pay for Kiwi workers is nearly a third higher than in 2008, an average annual increase of around 4% in take-home pay at a time when inflation was 1.5%.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Supplementary question, Andrew Bailey.
How does higher take-home pay for workers under this government compare to previous governments?
Oh, that's a good question. The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, since the government was elected, real take-home pay, that is income after taxes and excluding inflation, has increased around 2.2% per annum. In the 10 years up to 2008, the increase was around 0.5% per annum. So take-home pay after inflation and after tax is increasing around 4 times the rate in this 10 years than it did in the previous decade.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Minister, if the minimum wage in 2008, when they became the government, was $12 per hour, what is it now, and what percentage increase is that over 8 years?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can't confirm the figure. I can't confirm the figure the member used, but the minimum wage has increased roughly around the rate of inflation through a bit of head inflation over the last 8 years, with the effect that New Zealand has one of the highest minimum wages relative to average wages in the developed world.
Order.
Point of order, Speaker.
Order. Point of order, the Right Honourable Winston.
Speaker, I've asked him a direct question. I'm asking him, what is the minimum wage now? And we're still waiting for the answer.
That wasn't the question the member asked. He prefaced it with something else, talking about the minimum. Or the member can resume his seat. He needs to go back and look at the Hansard, but his initial start to the question was around, given that the minimum wage was $12 an hour in 2008, and the Minister certainly addressed that part. Well, I've ruled on that matter.
I know what the rules are, Mr. Speaker, about arguing with the Speaker's ruling.
I just have the point of order.
My point is that if it was, as it was, $12 per hour in 2008 when they became the government, what is it now?
Order. And the members put that into his question, giving the Minister the opportunity to answer that part of a question. The member wants to ask simple, concise questions. I can help him get the answer. But and he asks a question like that, it has been addressed. Supplementary question, the Right Honourable
Minister, given that he has been in that position as Minister of Finance for 8 long years, what now, right now, is the minimum wage in New Zealand?
The Honourable Bill English.
$15.25 an hour.
Point of order, Speaker.
Point of order.
Speaker, now that's the very point I sought to make. He did have the answer, but he wouldn't give it.
Order. Member will resume his seat. If he's going... Order. I explained to the member I tried to assist him with answering questions, but the first answer that was given certainly addressed the question the way it was raised. The member then asked a supplementary question and got the answer he wanted. Supplementary question?
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. How have the...
Order. I ask the member to stand and withdraw that remark immediately.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw and apologise if you took offence. I'm talking about the
Order.
minister's answer.
The member will stand now and withdraw without any addition, otherwise he'll be leaving the chamber.
Mr. Speaker, I don't wish to waste this Parliament's time by apologising for you on that matter. It was crap and it is crap.
Then the member will leave the chamber. Order. 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 Point of order, Honourable David Parker.
Was the Right Honourable Winston Peters ejected because he called an answer of the government crap, or did you take it to be a reference to yourself? Because I would have thought a reference to the government answer being crap is not outside standing orders.
I don't need the assistance. I took it to be very much a criticism of myself. I asked the member to withdraw. He withdrew and embellished that, and he then decided that he wouldn't withdraw in line with standing orders and chose to leave the chamber. I hope the member's not going to be continuing.
Well, the Right Honourable Winston Peters made it clear that it wasn't addressed to you, sir, and I don't think it unambiguously was.
I found it, the way it was addressed, was offensive. I took offence at it. I asked him to withdraw. That is the end of the matter. Supplementary question, Andrew Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How have the most vulnerable in our society benefited from improving economic conditions?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, they have benefited from an increase in the minimum wage, which is now $15.25 per hour, and is one of the highest minimum wages relative to the average wage in the developed world. Also, families with children on benefits enjoyed or had the benefit of $25 increase in their rate of benefit in 1 April this year, the first such increase over and above Consumer Price Index in 42 years. And of course, because we have a growing economy and government books in surpluses, with surpluses likely to increase, government has choices in the future, for instance, about better public services that may enable us to better support the most vulnerable.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
Does he really think the most vulnerable in New Zealand are benefiting when the New Zealand Income Survey last week said, and I quote, "There is evidence of higher after-housing costs income inequality in the last few years as compared with the mid-2000s and earlier." And Tracy Watkins in the Dominion Post said, it is now a clear picture of who is shouldering the biggest burden of the housing crisis in New Zealand, the poorest households.
Bring the question to a conclusion. The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased the member now agrees with the government position on this. The government's been pointing out for some time that poor planning and an ideology that says all cities should be small and dense hurts low and middle income New Zealand families because it drives up the cost of housing. And I'm pleased to see that Auckland City, for instance, has adopted a new, much more expansive plan which provides hope for low and middle income households that in the longer term housing costs will be more reasonable.
Question number 3.